Deep within the fortified walls of the Astor estate, a syndicate kingpin watches his only son fade away. The finest medical minds in the world have unplugged the life support, whispering that hope is permanently gone. But destiny possesses a wicked sense of irony. It wouldn't be a billion-dollar neurosurgeon who pulled the boy from the edge of the abyss, but a disgraced, penniless mother from the wrong side of town. One desperate woman, one ruthless empire, a collision that will rewrite the laws of life and death. Victor Castiglione possessed the kind of power that made city officials tremble and federal judges look the other way. As the undisputed head of the Chicago-based Castiglione syndicate, his empire was built on a foundation of ruthless efficiency, unbreakable loyalty, and cold calculation. Yet, all the wealth and influence in the world amounted to absolutely nothing inside the sterile, chillingly quiet walls of the pediatric intensive care unit at the prestigious Harrington Memorial Hospital. Standing over the mechanical bed was a man broken in half. Victor's broad shoulders, usually cloaked in tailored Italian wool, slumped in defeat. His 7-year-old son, Matteo, lay beneath a labyrinth of plastic tubes, wire sensors, and heavy synthetic blankets. Matteo was the sole heir to the Castiglione dynasty, the only light remaining in Victor's notoriously dark life after his wife passed away 5 years prior. Now that light was being aggressively snuffed out by an invisible enemy. For 3 agonizing months, Matteo had been trapped in a deep, unresponsive coma, triggered by what the specialists identified as an aggressive treatment-resistant strain of autoimmune encephalitis. The boy's immune system had inexplicably turned against his own brain, plunging him into a locked-in state that had deteriorated into complete unresponsiveness. Dr. Harrison Croft, the chief of neurology, and a man whose consultation fee rivaled the price of a luxury car, stood on the opposite side of the bed. He adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses, avoiding Victor's piercing gaze. "Mr. Castiglione!" Dr. Croft began, his voice practiced and clinically detached. "We have exhausted every protocol. The high-dose intravenous steroids, the plasmapheresis, the experimental immunosuppressants shipped in from Geneva. His brainstem reflexes are fading. The cortical mapping shows negligible activity. It is the consensus of the medical board that Matteo has entered an irreversible vegetative state. The humane course of action would be to discuss transitioning to palliative care." Victor didn't yell. He didn't reach across the bed and strangle the doctor, though the instinct flared violently in his chest. Instead, his voice dropped to a terrifying absolute whisper. "You are telling me that the man I paid $10 million to build a private research wing cannot fix a 7-year-old boy. Medicine is not a transaction." "Victor," Dr. Croft replied, a bead of sweat forming at his temple, despite the room's aggressive air conditioning. "We cannot buy miracles." "Get out," Victor commanded softly, "before I forget that you are a civilian." As the doctor scurried from the room, Victor collapsed into the plastic chair beside the bed, burying his face in his hands. From the shadows of the hallway stepped Arthur Pendleton, Victor's oldest confidant and most lethal enforcer. Arthur had known Matteo since the boy was born. "Boss," Arthur murmured, stepping into the room, "Croft is a coward, but he's the best on paper. If he says it's over—" "It is not over until I say he is gone, Arthur." Victor snarled, his eyes red-rimmed. "Find someone else. Find the people who operate outside the board. The witch doctors, the experimental labs, the disgraced geniuses. I don't care. Find me a miracle." Across the city, far from the manicured lawns and private security details of the elite, Nora Harding wiped a greasy rag across the Formica counter of a 24-hour diner. The neon sign outside buzzed a flickering, aggressive red, casting long, bruised shadows across her exhausted face. Nora was 32, running on 4 hours of sleep and a dangerous amount of black coffee. Once Nora had been the rising star of pediatric physical rehabilitation at the Prescott Medical Group. She had possessed an uncanny, almost intuitive gift for neuromuscular recovery, pioneering holistic therapies that combined deep tissue neural stimulation with sensory acoustic anchoring. She had successfully coaxed 3 separate children out of deep catatonic states, earning her the nickname the Whisperer among the nursing staff. But her brilliance had threatened the ego of her ex-husband, Dr. Simon Hayes, a manipulative pharmaceutical researcher who had covertly tied her name to a botched clinical trial. When the fallout hit, Simon walked away clean while Nora was stripped of her license, heavily fined and entirely blacklisted from the medical community. Now she was a single mother fighting a losing battle against the clock. Her 5-year-old daughter Lily had been born with a severe congenital heart defect. The temporizing surgeries had held up for years, but now Lily needed a comprehensive valve reconstruction. The cost was $250,000. Nora currently had $800 in her savings account. As Nora dumped the coffee grounds into the industrial trash bin, the diner's bell chimed. The establishment was empty at 3 a.m., save for a truck driver asleep in a corner booth. Nora turned to see a towering figure in a dark trench coat stepping out of the pouring rain. It was Arthur. He didn't sit in a booth. He walked directly to the counter, water dripping from the brim of his fedora. He looked at Nora's name tag, then up to her eyes, his gaze analytical and piercing. "Nora Harding," Arthur said. It wasn't a question. "Formerly of the Prescott Medical Group. The woman who woke the Miller boy from a stage 4 coma when the board said to pull the plug." Nora's grip tightened on the rag. Her instincts screamed that this man was dangerous. "I don't practice anymore. My license was revoked. If you're looking for a consultation, you need to call a hospital." "Hospitals gave up on my employer's son," Arthur replied, placing a thick, unmarked manila envelope on the counter. "My employer does not accept surrender. He knows about your past. He knows about your ex-husband's perjury. More importantly, he knows about your daughter Lily and the $250,000 you need by the end of the month." Nora froze, the breath catching in her throat. "Who are you? Have you been following me?" Arthur slid the envelope toward her. Inside is $50,000 in cash, a retainer. "If you get in the car with me right now and assess the boy, it's yours. If you bring him back, my employer will cover your daughter's surgery fly in the best cardiothoracic surgeon from Boston and secure a trust fund that ensures neither of you will ever work a shift in a place like this again." Nora stared at the envelope. It was thicker than any stack of money she had ever seen. "And if I can't wake him up?" Arthur's expression remained entirely stone. "Then you keep the $50,000 for your time, and you never speak of this night to a living soul. But Nora, do not mistake this for a charity offer. We are offering you a chance to save your daughter. In return, you must save his son." Nora thought of Lily's pale face, the blue tint that occasionally touched the little girl's lips when she played too hard. She thought of the eviction notices piling up on her cramped apartment's kitchen table. She reached out and pulled the envelope toward her chest. "Let me get my coat," she whispered. The drive to the Astor estate was undertaken in complete, suffocating silence. The black SUV wound through the affluent, heavily wooded suburbs of the North Shore, eventually passing through a set of imposing wrought-iron gates flanked by armed security guards. Nora clutched her worn medical bag, a relic from her past life that she couldn't bear to throw away tightly against her knees. When she was led into the mansion, the sheer scale of the wealth was disorienting. Marble floors, Renaissance artwork, and vaulted ceilings spoke of generational, untouchable power. But the house felt like a tomb. There was no warmth, no signs of life, only a heavy, grieving silence that pressed against Nora's chest. Arthur escorted her up a sweeping staircase and down a long corridor guarded by 2 men in tailored suits. He opened a pair of heavy oak doors, revealing a bedroom that had been entirely converted into a state-of-the-art intensive care unit. Standing by the window, staring out into the driving rain, was Victor Castiglione. He turned as Nora entered, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He was devastatingly handsome, with sharp aristocratic features and dark hair streaked with premature silver, but his eyes were completely hollow. They were the eyes of a man who had stared into the abyss for too long. "You're the disgraced therapist." Victor said, his voice a low melodic baritone that carried a lethal edge. The one they call a miracle worker behind closed doors. "My name is Nora," she replied, fighting to keep her voice steady, "and I don't perform miracles. I perform aggressive localized neurological rehabilitation. And I need to be clear, Mr. Castiglione, I am not a licensed doctor anymore. I don't care about pieces of paper." Victor stepped closer, towering over her. "Dr. Croft has a wall full of degrees, and he just told me to plan a funeral. Look at my son." Nora stepped toward the bed. Matteo looked impossibly small amidst the machinery. His skin was translucent, his chest rising and falling only with the mechanical assistance of a ventilator. She set her bag down and pulled out a small pen light. "May I?" she asked, though she didn't wait for permission. Nora gently lifted Matteo's eyelid, shining the light across his pupil. Sluggish, barely there but present, she ran her hands down the boy's arms, feeling the severe muscle atrophy. She tested the Babinski reflex on the sole of his foot. Nothing. She placed her fingers against his carotid artery, closing her eyes, feeling not just the pulse, but the rhythm of his body. They diagnosed him with autoimmune encephalitis. Nora murmured, her mind slipping back into the clinical brilliance she had buried for years. "They've been suppressing his immune system." "Yes," Victor said sharply, "to stop his body from attacking his brain." Nora frowned, looking at the complex IV drips beside the bed. "Who oversees his daily medication since you brought him home?" "A private nursing team supervised by Dr. Croft." Victor answered, his eyes narrowing. "Why?" "Because his muscle rigidity isn't consistent with late-stage encephalitis," Nora noted, moving to the boy's head. She gently palpated the base of Matteo's skull, applying deep pressure to a specific cluster of nerves. Suddenly, Matteo's left index finger twitched. It was a microscopic movement, but in a comatose patient, it was a thunderclap. Victor gasped, surging forward. "He moved. I saw that he moved." "It's a localized reflex," Nora said, stepping back, her heart pounding. She looked at Victor, realizing the immense danger she was in. This wasn't just a sick boy. This was the son of a mob boss surrounded by enemies. "Mr. Castiglione, I don't think he's in a natural coma anymore. The encephalitis might have caused the initial crash, but something else is keeping him under. His neural pathways aren't dead. They're suppressed, heavily." Victor's face darkened, a terrifying storm brewing in his expression. "Are you telling me my son is being drugged?" "I'm saying the cocktail of phenobarbital and synthetic sedatives he's receiving is far too high for a boy his size, even for seizure prophylaxis," Nora explained, pointing to the bags of fluid. "If I am going to treat him, I have to take him off everything. I have to shock his system, rebuild his neural pathways from the ground up using acoustic, tactile, and thermal stimulation. It will be violent. He might seize. His vitals will spike. It will look like he is dying before he wakes up." Victor stared at her, the silence stretching until it felt like a physical weight. "If you take him off the machines and he dies, you will not leave this house alive, Nora Harding. I will make sure of it." Nora's blood ran cold. The threat wasn't an exaggeration. It was a promise. She looked at the door, her survival instinct screaming at her to grab the $50,000 and run. She could take Lily and disappear. But then she looked back at Matteo. She saw the same fragile vulnerability she saw in Lily's eyes every time her heart monitor beeped in the hospital. "I won't let him die," Nora said, her voice finding a sudden steel resolve. "But I need complete control. No Dr. Croft, no interference, and I need a guarantee that my daughter is protected and her surgery is funded the moment I begin, not when I finish." Victor studied her, searching for any sign of deception. Finding none, he gave a curt nod. "Arthur will arrange the funds for your daughter immediately. The medical wing is yours. Do whatever it takes. But know this, you hold 2 lives in your hands now. His and yours. Within 24 hours, the Hawthorne estate had been transformed into a battleground for a child's soul. Nora dismissed the entire private nursing staff, retaining only Arthur to assist with the heavy lifting and physical support. She brought Lily to the estate, setting her up in a lavish guest suite down the hall, where Victor had stationed a private pediatric nurse to monitor her heart condition round the clock. Knowing Lily was safe and her surgery was fully paid for gave Nora the laser-like focus she needed. The first step was the hardest, the weaning. Under Nora's strict calculations, she began reducing Mateo's heavy sedatives and immunosuppressants. The withdrawal was brutal. By day 3, Mateo was running a fever of 103 degrees. His body trembled violently as the artificial dampeners were lifted, exposing his damaged nervous system to a flood of raw stimuli. Victor stood in the corner of the room, a silent, brooding gargoyle watching his son shake. "Is this supposed to happen?" he demanded, his voice thick with repressed panic as the heart monitor began to shriek a rapid, erratic rhythm. "His brain is rebooting," Nora shouted over the noise, pressing ice packs to the boy's neck and groin. "It's a chaotic electrical storm. Hold his shoulders down, Arthur." Arthur pinned the boy's shoulders gently but firmly, while Nora began her unconventional therapy. She didn't use drugs. She used high-frequency tuning forks, striking them and placing the vibrating metal against the bones behind Mateo's ears, stimulating the auditory nerve directly. She used alternating hot and cold compresses on his spine, forcing the brainstem to register extreme temperature shifts. "Come back, Mateo," Nora whispered fiercely, digging her thumbs into the pressure points on the palms of his hands. "Find the signal, push through the noise." For an hour, the room was a war zone of alarms, sweat, and tension, and then suddenly, the fever broke. Mateo's body went entirely limp, and the erratic shrieking of the heart monitor slowed down to a steady rhythmic beep. Victor rushed forward, his face pale. Did you kill him?" "No." Nora breathed heavily, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Look at the brainwave monitor." The flat, sluggish waves that had plagued Mateo's charts for months were gone. In their place were the jagged, beautiful peaks and valleys of active cortical function. He was still unconscious, but he was no longer a vegetable. He was sleeping. Victor reached out his trembling hand, lightly brushing his son's sweat-soaked hair. For the first time, Nora saw the terrifying Mafia Boss cry. A single tear slipped down his cheek. He's fighting. He's a fighter, Mr. Castiglione." Nora smiled tiredly. "But we are far from out of the woods. He needs constant stimulation. We have to rebuild the bridge between his brain and his body." Over the next week, Nora barely slept. She worked with Mateo in 6-hour shifts, manipulating his limbs, playing classical music mixed with the recorded sounds of Victor's voice, and using microcurrent electrical pads to force his muscles to contract. Slowly, the miracles compounded. A voluntary swallow, the independent movement of a toe, the pupils reacting briskly to light. But as Mateo grew stronger, Nora began to notice something deeply disturbing. Every evening, a fresh supply of IV saline and supplemental nutrition bags were delivered to the estate by a courier from Dr. Croft's clinic. Victor had insisted on maintaining the nutritional support from the hospital, despite banning the staff. On the 8th night, Nora was preparing to hang a new bag of Total Parenteral Nutrition TPN when she noticed a tiny, almost invisible puncture mark near the injection port of the sealed bag. The plastic seal was intact, but someone had used a microneedle to introduce something into the fluid. Her blood turned to ice. She took a syringe, extracted a small amount of the fluid from the bag, and walked down the hall to the makeshift chemical testing kit she had brought from her old clinic. She ran a rapid reagent test. 10 minutes later, the liquid turned a bright toxic purple. It wasn't just nutrition. It was laced with synthetic curare, a powerful paralytic agent that mimicked the symptoms of a locked-in coma. It wouldn't kill the boy, but it would ensure he never woke up. It would keep him trapped in his own body forever. Nora backed away from the table, her hand flying to her mouth. Dr. Croft's original diagnosis wasn't just a mistake, it was a cover-up. Someone was actively trying to keep the heir to the Castiglione Empire incapacitated. Before she could process the gravity of her discovery, the heavy oak door of the laboratory clicked open. She spun around expecting to see Victor or Arthur. Instead, standing in the doorway with a suppressed pistol in his hand was one of Victor's most trusted inner circle lieutenants, a man who had been guarding the hallway since Nora arrived. "You're a very smart woman, Nora," the lieutenant said smoothly, raising the weapon. "But some children are meant to stay asleep." Nora stared down the barrel of the suppressed pistol, her breath hitching in her throat. The man holding the weapon was Dominic, a lieutenant she had seen Victor trust with the security coordinates of the entire estate. He stepped fully into the makeshift laboratory, his eyes dead and unfeeling. The silencer on his weapon looked obscenely large in the sterile bright lights of the medical wing. "Nothing personal." "Nora," Dominic said, his voice entirely devoid of malice, which somehow made it worse. "Carmine Romano sends his regards. He can't have the Castiglione heir waking up and uniting the syndicate behind Victor again. The boss is vulnerable while the boy is a vegetable. That's how empires change hands." Nora's mind raced. Her hands were still resting on the stainless steel counter inches from the chemical testing tray. "You won't get away with this," she said, trying to keep her voice from trembling. "Victor will strip you down to the bone." "Victor is grieving. He's distracted," Dominic countered, raising the gun to her forehead. "You're just a disgraced therapist who couldn't handle the pressure. You administered the wrong medication, the boy crashed, and you took your own life out of guilt. It's a tragic story, but the press will eat it up." Dominic's finger tightened on the trigger. Nora didn't think. She reacted with the pure primal instinct of a mother who knew her daughter was sleeping just 2 doors down. Her hand shot out, grabbing the glass beaker filled with the volatile purple reagent, testing fluid, a highly acidic compound mixed with synthetic curare, and hurled it directly into Dominic's face. The liquid struck his eyes. Dominic screamed a raw, guttural sound of pure agony, instinctively firing the weapon. The suppressed gunshot made a sharp thwip sound, the bullet shattering the glass cabinet behind Nora's head, raining sharp shards over her shoulders. He dropped the gun, clawing at his burning eyes. Nora didn't wait. She grabbed a heavy cast-iron oxygen tank wrench from the medical cart and swung it with every ounce of strength she possessed, striking Dominic across the temple. He collapsed to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut, groaning in a heap. The heavy oak doors burst open. Arthur stormed in a massive hand cannon already drawn and leveled. A fraction of a second later, Victor was behind him, his eyes scanning the room with the lethal precision of a predator. He saw the shattered glass the reagent spilled on the floor, and Dominic writhing on the tiles. What happened? Victor's voice was a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Nora dropped the wrench, her knees finally giving out. She slid down the front of the cabinets, her chest heaving, as she pointed a shaking finger at the IV bag on the testing table. He was poisoning him. Someone has been lacing Matteo's nutritional bags with a synthetic paralytic. It wasn't the encephalitis keeping him under, Victor. He was locked in. Conscious but completely paralyzed. Dominic tried to kill me to cover it up. The silence that followed her words was heavier than a physical blow. Victor walked slowly over to the IV bag, staring at it. The realization that his son had been trapped in the dark, poisoned under his own roof by the men he paid to protect him, washed over his features. The handsome, grieving father vanished, replaced entirely by the ruthless syndicate kingpin who had conquered the Chicago underworld. Victor turned to Dominic. Arthur had already hauled the blinded, bleeding lieutenant to his knees, pressing the barrel of his gun into the base of the man's skull. "Dominic," Victor whispered, crouching down so he was eye level with the traitor. "You have known Matteo since he was born. You bought him a wooden train set for his 3rd birthday. Victor, please." Dominic choked out his eyes, squeezed shut, tears of blood and chemical burns streaking his cheeks. "Romano, he threatened my family. He said if I didn't swap the bags the courier brought from Croft's clinic, he would burn my house down with my wife inside. You should have let him, Victor said, his voice devoid of any human emotion, because what I am going to do to you will make Romano look like a saint. Victor stood up and looked at Arthur. Take him to the basement, find out exactly how many men inside my house belong to Carmine Romano, and when he is done talking, make sure he never speaks again. Yes, boss, Arthur said, dragging the sobbing man out of the room by his collar. Victor turned back to Nora. She was trembling on the floor, a thin cut on her cheek where a piece of glass had grazed her. In 2 long strides, he crossed the room and dropped to his knees in front of her. The monster vanished, and the man returned. He gently reached out his thumb, brushing the drop of blood from her cheek. His touch was shockingly warm, a stark contrast to the coldness of his words seconds prior. Are you hurt? He asked, his dark eyes searching hers intensely. I'm fine, Nora breathed, staring at his strong jawline. But we can't stay here. If Romano knows I discovered the poison, he won't stop at sending 1 mole. He'll send an army, and Lily is upstairs. No one is touching your daughter. I gave you my word, Victor said, his gaze dropping to her lips for a fraction of a second before returning to her eyes. Pack your equipment. Pack the boy. We leave in 10 minutes. They moved like ghosts in the night. Victor bypassed his entire security detail, trusting only Arthur and a hand-picked squad of 3 men whose loyalty had been tested in blood. They loaded Matteo into the back of a modified armored ambulance, with Nora sitting by his side, monitoring the portable life support. Lily, groggy and clutching a stuffed rabbit, rode in the heavily fortified SUV with Victor. Their destination was a location not on any map, a brutalist subterranean safe house built into the bedrock of the Wisconsin wilderness 2 hours north of the city. Originally constructed during the Cold War, Victor had modernized it into an impenetrable fortress with its own generator surgical theater and independent water supply. Once underground, the heavy steel blast doors locked behind them, sealing them off from the rest of the world. Without the paralytic poison coursing through his veins, Matteo's recovery accelerated at a terrifying, beautiful pace. Nora worked with him around the clock, her hands constantly moving, massaging atrophied muscles, guiding him through passive range of motion exercises, and speaking to him in a soft, steady rhythm. Victor rarely left the room. He sat in the corner, silent sentinel, watching Nora. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the gentle cadence of her voice, the fierce maternal protection she offered a child that wasn't even hers. In his world, women were either transactional companions or fragile liabilities. Nora was neither. She was a warrior in scrubs wielding tuning forks and reflex hammers instead of guns. On their 4th day in the bunker, the miracle finally happened. Nora was shining a penlight into Matteo's eyes, checking his pupillary response. Come on, buddy, she whispered. You've been resting long enough. Open the blinds. Let the light in. Matteo's eyelids fluttered, not the sluggish drug-induced twitch of a coma patient, but a deliberate conscious flutter. Victor stood up so fast his steel chair clattered to the concrete floor. Matteo's eyes slowly opened. They were a striking, deep hazel, identical to his father's. He blinked against the harsh overhead lights, his brow crinkling in confusion. He looked at Nora, then slowly rolled his head to the side. His gaze locked onto the towering, broad-shouldered man standing frozen at the foot of the bed. Beneath the oxygen cannula, Matteo's dry, cracked lips parted. His vocal cords hadn't been used in months, producing a sound that was barely a rasp, rough and agonizingly quiet. Papa? Victor Castiglione, the man who had ordered executions without a second thought, the man who held the city's underworld in an iron grip, broke completely. He fell to his knees beside the bed, burying his face in the mattress near his son's hand, his broad shoulders shaking with deep, silent sobs. I'm here, mio leone. Victor wept, kissing the boy's frail fingers. Papa is here. You're safe. Nora stepped back, giving them space, tears streaming down her own face. She felt a small hand tug on her scrub pants. She looked down to see Lily standing in the doorway, her pale face looking up at her mother. "Is the boy awake, Mommy?" Lily asked softly. "Yes, baby." Nora smiled through her tears, picking her daughter up. He woke up. Later that night, after Mateo had eaten his first few bites of solid food and fallen into a natural healing sleep, Victor found Nora in the small communal kitchen of the bunker. She was making tea, staring blankly at the metal wall. Victor stepped into the room, the dim light casting shadows across his sharp cheekbones. He walked over to her, standing much closer than personal space normally dictated. The scent of his cedar espresso and clean linen enveloped her. "Dr. Croft told me to plan a funeral," Victor said softly, his deep voice wrapping around her like a heavy blanket. "He told me there was no hope. You gave me my life back today, Nora." "He did the hard work," Nora replied, looking up at him. She felt a sudden dangerous flutter in her stomach. Victor was a lethal man, a criminal, but looking into his eyes now, all she saw was profound gratitude and a magnetic, undeniable heat. "I have spent my entire life building walls, hoarding power to make sure nothing could ever hurt me." Victor reached out his large, rough hand, gently tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The contact sent a jolt of electricity down Nora's spine. "But you walked into my house with nothing but a medical bag and saved the only thing I care about. Ask me for anything, Nora. It's yours." "I just want Lily's surgery," she whispered, her breath catching as his thumb traced her jawline. "The best cardiothoracic surgeon from Boston is on a private jet as we speak." Victor promised, stepping even closer, his chest almost brushing hers. "He will perform the surgery here in the bunker's theater. But I'm not just talking about the contract anymore. I am talking about you. I want to take care of you, Nora, both of you. Nobody will ever look down on you, threaten you, or hurt you again. You belong under my protection now." Before Nora could process the heavy, possessive weight of his words, Arthur burst into the kitchen, his face grim. "Boss," Arthur interrupted entirely, ignoring the intimate tension in the room. "We have a massive problem. Dominic gave up the estate's security codes before he died, but he lied about one thing. Carmine Romano didn't just want Mateo dead, he wanted the whole bloodline." Victor's hand dropped from Nora's face, his posture instantly shifting from tender to lethal. "Explain." "The Boston surgeon landed at O'Hare an hour ago," Arthur said tightly. "But my men didn't pick him up. Romano's men intercepted the convoy. They have the surgeon, and they sent a message." Arthur held up a burner phone. "They know about the bunker. They're coming." The atmosphere in the subterranean fortress shifted from cautious optimism to suffocating dread. The heavy steel walls, once a source of comfort, now felt like a tomb. Nora rushed back to Lily's room. The stress of the environment and the sudden move had taken a toll on the 5-year-old. Lily was pale, her breathing shallow, the blue tint around her lips more pronounced than it had been in weeks. The congenital heart defect was flaring up. Without the valve reconstruction surgery, Nora knew she was running on borrowed time. Victor entered the room fully geared in a black tactical vest, a matte black assault rifle slung across his chest. He looked like the devil himself, cold and completely terrifying. He looked at Lily's monitor, then met Nora's terrified eyes. "Romano took the doctor to force me out," Victor stated, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "He knows I won't let your daughter die. He expects me to surrender my territory and my life in exchange for the surgeon." "Victor, if they know we're here," Nora started, clutching Lily's small hand. "They are already in the woods," Victor confirmed. "Proximity sensors picked up movement a mile out. At least 50 heavily armed mercenaries. Romano hired an outside cartel to do the heavy lifting." "We're trapped," Nora whispered, panic finally seizing her chest. "Mateo can't run and Lily is too weak." "You are not trapped," Victor said, crossing the room. He placed his heavy gloved hands on her shoulders, forcing her to look directly into his eyes. "I am going to leave the bunker. I will take Arthur and my men, and we will hit them in the forest before they can reach the reinforced doors. We will carve a path through them, retrieve the surgeon, and bring him back. You're walking into a suicide mission. Nora grabbed the heavy canvas of his tactical vest. 50 men, Victor, you have 3. I am Victor Castiglione, he said softly, a dark, arrogant smirk touching his lips. I don't need an army to kill Carmine Romano. Lock the blast doors behind me. Do not open them for anyone but me or Arthur. If I don't come back by dawn, there is an emergency tunnel in the sublevel that leads to a boat on the lake. Take the children and run. Don't say that, Nora pleaded, surprising herself with the desperation in her voice. She pulled him down by the collar of his vest and pressed her lips fiercely to his. It was a desperate, bruising kiss, fueled by adrenaline fear and a sudden, undeniable connection that had forged in the crucible of the past 10 days. Victor groaned his arms, wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against his armored chest. He kissed her back with a possessive territorial hunger, stealing the breath from her lungs. When he finally pulled away, his eyes were blazing. I am coming back for you. Victor swore, his forehead resting against hers. Keep my son breathing. I will bring the man who will fix your daughter. Victor turned and marched out of the room. A minute later, Nora heard the massive hydraulic hiss of the main blast doors opening, followed by the heavy thud of them sealing shut again. She was alone with 2 sick children and a handful of medical supplies. In the medical wing, Matteo was awake, his eyes darting around the room. Nora hurried to his side, checking his vitals. Where is Papa? Matteo rasped, his voice stronger than before. He went to get some help, sweetheart. Nora lied smoothly, brushing the hair from his forehead. Matteo looked at her, his young eyes holding a haunting maturity. I heard them, when I was asleep in the big house. Nora froze. You heard who Matteo... The doctor with the glasses. Dr. Croft. Matteo said slowly, struggling to form the words. He used to come into my room at night. He talked on his phone. He told a man named Carmine that the poison was working. He said Papa would give up soon. Nora's blood boiled. Dr. Croft wasn't just being blackmailed. He was a willing conspirator. He had sold out a child for a payout. Before Nora could process the anger, the entire bunker violently shuddered. Dust rained down from the concrete ceiling. The lights flickered, died, and then the red emergency lighting kicked on, bathing the sterile room in a demonic crimson glow. The proximity alarm on the wall began to shriek a high-pitched rhythmic wail that signaled a perimeter breach. Victor and Arthur hadn't intercepted all of them in the woods. Someone had slipped past the defensive line. Nora heard the distinct, terrifying sound of heavy explosives detonating against the outer blast door. They were trying to blow their way in. She looked at Matteo, who was trembling, and then down the hall to where Lily lay sleeping. The disgraced therapist took a deep breath, her maternal instincts overriding her terror. She walked over to the medical cart, bypassing the bandages and syringes, and picked up the heavy cast-iron wrench she had used on Dominic. She gripped it tightly, stepping into the red-lit hallway, placing herself directly between the heavy steel doors and the children she had sworn to protect. If Carmine Romano's men wanted to finish the job, they would have to go through a mother with nothing left to lose. The subterranean walls trembled again, a violent, teeth-rattling vibration that sent sterile instruments clattering off the metal trays. The thick layer of reinforced concrete separating the medical wing from the outer corridor was designed to withstand a mortar strike, but whoever Carmine Romano had hired possessed industrial-grade thermite. Nora Harding stood perfectly still in the bleeding crimson light of the emergency bulbs. Her fingers gripped the heavy iron oxygen wrench so tightly her knuckles were stark white. Behind her, the heavy blast doors of the pediatric ward were sealed tight. Inside, Matteo Castiglione was wide awake, his frail hands gripping the guardrails of his bed, while down the hall, 5-year-old Lily remained trapped in an exhausted, terrifyingly fragile sleep. A deafening crack echoed through the corridor, followed by the screech of tearing steel. The outer barricade had failed. Heavy tactical boots crunched over the debris. Nora backed into the shadows of the sterilization alcove, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She was not a soldier. She was a mother and a healer. She watched two heavily armed mercenaries step through the smoke, their laser sights cutting through the dark like predatory red eyes. Something ancient and ruthless awakened within her. Check the sublevels. The lead mercenary, a scarred giant named Gideon, barked into his headset. Romano wants the kids alive if possible to use his leverage against Castiglione. If anyone else is down here, put them in the ground. Nora's eyes darted around the alcove. She saw a massive pressurized cylinder of pure medical oxygen clamped to the wall, and next to it, the portable defibrillator unit she had used during Matteo's withdrawal phase. A desperate, insane plan formed in her mind. She quietly unspooled the defibrillator paddles, dialing the joule output to its maximum setting. Then, with agonizing slowness, she reached out with the heavy wrench and tapped the emergency release valve on the oxygen tank. A loud, aggressive hiss filled the corridor as pure, highly combustible oxygen flooded the confined space. The second mercenary whipped his rifle toward the sound. "What is that?" "Gas leak," Gideon muttered, stepping forward, his flashlight piercing the gloom. "Spread out!" Nora didn't hesitate. As the second mercenary stepped directly in front of the alcove, she lunged forward. She didn't strike him with the wrench. Instead, she slammed the two charged defibrillator paddles directly against the metal grating beneath his feet and hit the shock button. The electrical arc ignited the concentrated oxygen instantly. A concussive, blinding flashbang of pure blue fire erupted in the corridor. The second mercenary was thrown backward, his tactical vest smoking, screaming as the shock wave shattered his eardrums. Gideon, shielded by the corner of the wall, cursed and raised his assault rifle, firing blindly into the alcove. Bullets chewed through the drywall, shattering glass cabinets and sending showers of sparks raining down. Nora scrambled across the floor glass, biting into her knees, and ducked behind the reinforced surgical table. "You're dead, you stupid bitch!" Gideon roared, racking the bolt of his weapon and advancing through the smoke. He kicked the medical cart aside, leveling his weapon directly at the space where Nora was huddled. She squeezed her eyes shut, raising the wrench in a futile final gesture. But the gunshot never came. Instead, a sound like a wet branch snapping echoed through the corridor. Nora opened her eyes. Standing directly behind Gideon was Victor Castiglione. His tailored tactical gear was soaked in rain and soot. His face was an emotionless, terrifying mask of absolute violence. Before the mercenary could even pivot, Victor had wrapped a thick leather-gloved forearm around the man's throat, driving a combat knife up into the soft tissue beneath his tactical rig. Gideon collapsed without a sound. Victor stepped over the body, breathing heavily, his chest heaving. He looked down at Nora, his dark eyes instantly softening from the gaze of a killer to that of a protector. He dropped the knife and reached down, pulling her off the glass-covered floor and into his chest. "I told you," Victor whispered fiercely into her hair, his massive hands trembling as they held her. "I am coming back for you." "Victor!" Nora gasped, burying her face in his tactical vest, inhaling the sharp scent of gunpowder and cold rain. "Lily, she's getting worse. Her lips are blue. We don't have time." "Then we don't wait," a new voice wheezed. Arthur limped through the ruined doorway, leaning heavily on a shattered rifle. He was bleeding from a graze on his shoulder, but in his left hand, he held the collar of a terrified, trembling man wearing a torn designer suit. It was Dr. William Harris, the chief of pediatric cardiothoracic surgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital. He was widely considered the finest valve reconstruction specialist in the Western Hemisphere, and right now, he looked like he was going to pass out. I can't operate in a war zone," Dr. Harris stammered, staring in horror at the bodies on the floor. "I need my team. I need an anesthesiologist, a perfusionist. The power is fluctuating." Victor released Nora and crossed the room in 2 strides. He grabbed the world-renowned surgeon by the lapels and lifted him an inch off the ground. "Listen to me very carefully, Dr. Harris," Victor said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth. "My men just slaughtered 40 of Carmine Romano's cartel outside to pull you out of that transport van. The woman standing behind me is Nora Harding, the finest medical mind I have ever encountered. She will be your anesthesiologist. She will be your perfusionist. If you need a nurse, Arthur will hold the scalpels. But you are going to walk into that room, and you are going to fix that little girl's heart. If her heart stops beating, yours does too. Do we understand each other? Dr. Aris swallowed hard, his eyes wide behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He gave a frantic, jerky nod. Good, Victor said, setting the man down. He looked at Nora. Save our daughter. The word hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Our daughter. Nora felt a surge of adrenaline so powerful it washed away her exhaustion. She nodded, grabbing Dr. Aris by the arm. Scrub in, Doctor. Nora commanded, her voice turning pure clinical steel. We have a life to save. The bunker's primary surgical theater was a marvel of black market engineering. Outfitted with a Medtronic cardiopulmonary bypass machine, overhead LED arrays, and a fully stocked pharmaceutical dispensary, it rivaled the finest trauma centers in Chicago. But as Nora wheeled Lily's small, unconscious form onto the operating table, the red emergency lights flickered menacingly. The main grid had been severed during the assault. They were running purely on the diesel backup generators. Her oxygen saturation is dropping to 82%. Nora reported, swiftly attaching the pediatric EKG leads to Lily's fragile chest. She's tachycardic. We need to induce now before the ventricle fails entirely. Dr. Aris, having washed his hands in the scrub basin, stood paralyzed in the doorway. The sterile gown hung loosely on his shaking frame. He was a man used to classical music, playing in pristine, brightly lit rooms, surrounded by a dozen assisting specialists. Now he was deep underground, accompanied by a disgraced therapist and guarded by mobsters. "Doctor," Nora barked, slamming her hand flat against the stainless steel tray. "Look at me." Aris flinched, his eyes snapping to hers. "Forget where you are," Nora said, her voice dropping to a hypnotic, steady cadence. "Forget the guns. Forget the bunker. Look at the table. It's just a broken pump. You have fixed 1,000 of these. You are the mechanic, and I'm handing you the tools. Now step up." The raw authority in Nora's voice seemed to snap the surgeon out of his shock. He took a deep, shuddering breath, walked to the table, and looked down at Lily. The surgeon's hands, which had been trembling violently seconds before, suddenly grew perfectly, miraculously still. "Administer the propofol and fentanyl cocktail," Aris ordered, his voice finally projecting the quiet command of a chief surgeon. "Prepare the sternal saw. We need to open the chest and get her on the bypass machine before the arrhythmia becomes fatal." Nora moved with blinding speed, her past life as a top-tier medical professional roaring back into focus. She managed the complex pharmacology, calculating dosages on the fly without a computer pushing the sedatives into Lily's IV line. She's under, Nora confirmed, as Lily's chest stopped moving on its own. She swiftly inserted the endotracheal tube securing the airway and began manually bagging the child to keep her lungs inflated. The next hour was a grueling, terrifying ballet. Victor and Arthur stood outside the heavy glass observation window, watching the two medical professionals work in total silence. Victor's hands were pressed flat against the glass, his eyes locked on Nora. Dr. Aris opened Lily's chest, exposing the tiny, struggling heart. "Cannulating the aorta," he murmured, his hands moving with incredible precision. "Connecting the venous return. Harding, initiate the bypass pump." Nora activated the Medtronic machine. The complex array of tubes filled with dark crimson as Lily's blood was diverted away from her heart, oxygenated by the artificial lung, and pumped back into her body. "Heart is arrested," Dr. Aris said, applying the cold cardioplegia solution to stop the organ entirely. "Beginning the valve reconstruction. The tissue is extremely friable. The congenital defect is worse than the scans showed." For 45 minutes, the only sounds in the room were the rhythmic mechanical whoosh of the bypass machine and the sharp clink of surgical instruments. Nora managed the hemodynamics perfectly, constantly adjusting the artificial flow to keep Lily's brain perfused with oxygen. Then the lights flickered violently. The bunker groaned, and the heavy thrum of the diesel generator sputtered. The Medtronic bypass machine let out a high-pitched, terrifying warning alarm. "The pump is losing RPMs!" Nora shouted, her eyes locked on the digital display. "The power fluctuation is interrupting the centrifugal motor. Her pressure is dropping. I am not finished." Oris panicked, his hands freezing over the open chest cavity. If the pressure drops, she'll suffer massive ischemic strokes. The brain will die. "Keep sewing!" Nora screamed. She didn't wait for the machine to completely fail. She abandoned the monitor station, ran to the bypass console, and grabbed the manual hand crank attached to the side of the pump, an emergency failsafe designed for total power loss. Nora engaged the clutch and began turning the heavy metal crank with both hands. It required an immense amount of physical strength to maintain the precise necessary blood pressure for a pediatric patient. Her muscles screamed in protest, the veins in her neck bulging, but she established a brutal, unyielding rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. "Her pressure is stabilizing." Dr. Aris gasped, his eyes darting to the monitor before returning to the heart. "Harding, you have to maintain that exact speed. Do not slow down." "I won't," Nora gritted out, sweat pouring down her face. Her shoulders felt like they were tearing, but in her mind she saw only Lily smile. She saw Matteo opening his eyes. She saw Victor looking at her with a vulnerability he saved only for her. 1, 2, 3. 15 agonizing minutes passed. Nora's hands were blistered and bleeding, her arms completely numb. "Tying off the final suture," Aris announced, his voice tight. "Closing the atrium. Prepare to take her off bypass and restart the heart. Stop cranking, Harding." Nora let go of the handle, collapsing against the side of the machine, her chest heaving violently. Dr. Aris removed the clamps from the aorta, allowing warm blood to rush back into the reconstructed heart. He picked up the internal defibrillator paddles. "Charging to 10 joules. Clear." A tiny shock ran through Lily's chest. The heart lay still. Nora gripped the edge of the console, holding her breath. Outside the glass, Victor had stopped breathing entirely. "Charging to 15 joules. Clear," Aris said, his voice cracking. Another shock. For a terrifying second, the monitor displayed a flat green line. And then slowly, stubbornly, the line spiked. A jagged peak. Then another. Then a beautiful, steady, rhythmic wave. Beep, beep, beep. Lily's heart, perfectly repaired, was beating on its own. Dr. Aris stepped back, pulling down his surgical mask, tears freely flowing down his cheeks. He looked at Nora, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. "You are not a therapist, Ms. Harding. You are a titan. I have never seen anyone manage hemodynamics manually like that without crashing the patient." Nora couldn't speak. She slid down the side of the machine, burying her face in her hands, and wept with pure, unadulterated relief. The door to the theater swung open. Victor walked in, entirely ignoring the sterile protocol. He bypassed the surgeon, walked directly to where Nora was sitting on the floor, and picked her up in his arms. He held her tight against his chest, burying his face in her neck. "She's okay," Nora sobbed quietly into his shoulder. "Victor, she's okay." "I know," Victor murmured, kissing her forehead, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved her. You saved us all." He pulled back slightly, looking at her blistered, bloody hands. He kissed her palms gently, then turned his gaze toward the observation window, out into the dark corridors of the bunker. The tenderness vanished, replaced by a terrifying, glacial resolve. "Now," the King of Chicago said softly, "it is my turn." 5 days later, the storm had entirely passed over the Wisconsin wilderness. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere was one of profound peace. Lily was awake, her cheeks flushed with a healthy, vibrant pink she had never possessed in her entire life. She was sitting up in bed, drawing a picture of a massive, dark-haired knight fighting a dragon. In the bed next to hers, Matteo Castiglione was sitting up eating a bowl of oatmeal on his own. His motor functions were returning rapidly under Nora's continued loving therapy. The two children had bonded instantly, whispering to each other in the quiet hours of the morning. But Victor Castiglione was not in the bunker. 300 miles south at O'Hare International Airport, the VIP terminal of the first-class International Lounge was uncharacteristically empty. Dr. Harrison Croft sat nervously in a leather armchair clutching a titanium briefcase. Inside the case were the bearer bonds and offshore account codes for his newly established trust at the Cayman National Bank. He had booked a one-way private charter to Geneva. Carmine Romano's assault on the bunker had failed. The cartel mercenaries had been wiped out, and Romano himself had vanished into the wind. Croft knew it was only a matter of time before Victor's wrath fell upon the city. Flight 409 to Geneva is delayed, Dr. Croft. A deep velvet voice echoed across the empty lounge. Croft froze. The blood drained entirely from his face. He slowly turned his head to see Victor Castiglione sitting in the armchair opposite him. Victor was wearing a flawless three-piece charcoal suit, a glass of bourbon resting loosely in his hand. He looked completely relaxed, which made him infinitely more terrifying. Castiglione. Croft choked out his eyes, darting frantically toward the door. Two massive men in suits, Arthur and another enforcer, stood blocking the exit. "Don't look at them, Harrison. Look at me," Victor commanded softly. Croft snapped his attention back to the mob boss, trembling so violently his teeth chattered. "Victor, please, Romano forced me. He threatened my practice. He threatened to go to the medical board about my indiscretions. I didn't want to hurt Matteo." "You diagnosed an artificially induced paralysis as a terminal vegetative state," Victor said, taking a slow sip of his bourbon. "You watched a 7-year-old boy trap inside his own mind for 3 months, and you smiled in my face while you cashed Romano's checks." "I can give you the money back," Croft pleaded, pushing the titanium briefcase across the glass table. "Take it. Take all of it." Victor didn't even look at the case. "I don't want your money, Harrison, and I'm not going to kill you." Croft blinked, a desperate, pathetic glimmer of hope lighting up his eyes. You aren't... No, I'm a father now, first and foremost. I am leaving the shadows," Victor said, setting his glass down. "But before I step into the light, I made sure my house was completely clean. An hour ago, Carmine Romano's car exploded on the Dan Ryan Expressway, and as for you..." Victor leaned forward, his dark eyes boring into Croft's soul. "A package was just delivered to Federal Prosecutor David Kensington at the Department of Justice," Victor stated calmly. "It contains every financial record, every encrypted email, and a full recorded confession from your courier regarding the synthetic curare you used on my son. You are not going to Geneva, doctor. You are going to a federal supermax prison for the attempted murder of a minor medical malpractice and racketeering. You will spend the rest of your miserable life in a concrete box entirely locked in." I thought it was poetic. Croft opened his mouth to scream, but Arthur stepped forward, clamping a heavy hand over the doctor's mouth and dragging him out of the chair as the airport security doors breached and FBI agents swarmed the lounge. Victor stood up, adjusted his cuffs, and walked out of the terminal without looking back. His empire of blood was finished. A new empire was about to begin. 6 months later. The morning sun cast a golden glow across the manicured lawns of the newly established Castiglione Harding Neurological Institute. Located in the heart of downtown Chicago, the state-of-the-art facility was funded entirely by Victor's legitimate corporate holdings managed through the prestigious Goldman and Hastings legal firm. Nora Harding walked through the pristine glass-walled corridors wearing a crisp white lab coat. Her medical license hadn't just been reinstated, she'd been completely exonerated. Dr. Simon Hayes, her manipulative ex-husband, had mysteriously found his own fraudulent research exposed to the FDA, resulting in a permanent ban from the medical community. Nora opened the doors to the pediatric physical therapy wing. Inside, the sound of bright echoing laughter filled the air. Matteo Castiglione was walking. He had a slight limp, relying on a custom-made forearm crutch, but his steps were confident and strong. He was chasing Lily, who was giggling wildly as she darted between the foam therapy blocks. Her cheeks were bright, her energy boundless, her heart beating with perfect, unhindered rhythm. Standing by the window watching them with a soft, genuine smile was Victor. The dark shadows that used to haunt his eyes were completely gone. He turned as Nora entered his gaze, sweeping over her with the same intense, burning devotion he had shown in the bunker. He walked over to her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her close. "Dr. Eris called this morning," Victor murmured, kissing her temple. "He wants to fly out and consult with you on a new post-operative therapy protocol." "Tell him he has to make an appointment?" Nora smiled, resting her hands flat against Victor's broad chest. "I'm busy." "Busy doing what?" Victor asked, his voice a low rumble. "Watching my family," Nora said softly, looking over at Matteo and Lily, who had now collapsed onto a foam mat, giggling uncontrollably. Victor's heart swelled. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a small black velvet box. He didn't drop to one knee. He simply opened it, revealing a stunning, flawless, emerald-cut diamond ring. "You walked into the dark and pulled me out." "Nora," Victor said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave my son his life. You gave me a daughter. You gave me a soul. Marry me. Let me spend the rest of my life protecting the miracle you gave us." Nora looked at the ring, then up into the eyes of the ruthless kingpin who had surrendered his entire world for her. She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she whispered, pulling him down for a deep, passionate kiss. "Always." In the end, the medical community couldn't explain the miracle. They called it a statistical anomaly, a fortunate alignment of biology and luck. But those inside the walls knew the truth. Science didn't save the Castiglione heir, and money didn't save the little girl with the broken heart. They were saved by the unbreakable will of a mother, the lethal devotion of a father, and a love strong enough to conquer death itself. What a breathtaking conclusion. From the explosive shootout in the underground bunker to the intense high-stakes surgery and Victor's ultimate calculated revenge, Nora and Victor proved that absolutely nothing can stand in the way of a parent's love. They conquered the mafia underworld and the medical establishment to build a beautiful blended family. If this incredible story of redemption, fierce loyalty, and miraculous healing captured your heart, please smash that like button. Share this video with your fellow drama lovers, and subscribe for more pulse-pounding, real-life romantic thrillers. Let us know your favorite moment in the comments below.